Aggregate demand. What are the determinants of total spending in an economy? We know that an economy has a normal capacity level of output. It has a trend in terms of how its total output, its GDP, performs over time. That normal capacity level of output, that trend, whether it is constant over time or it's growing over time, is determined by the economy's level of the size of the labor force, by the amount of capital that is in the economy, by the state of its production technology, and by the institutions that govern commerce. But in any given year, output is not usually exactly equal to the economy's normal capacity or full employment level of output. In any given year, it can be above or below that. And if you look at GDP in a country over a 10 or 20-year period, you will see that the economy's output tends to fluctuate around its average level. What is the cause of those fluctuations? That is the question we'd like to answer. Why is it sometimes above? Why is it sometimes below? To explain fluctuations around an economy's trend level of output, we're going to use the market, the concept of the market. Now we know that a market can be employed narrowly or more broadly. We can speak about the market for oranges, or more broadly, the market for agricultural produce. What we're going to do is to apply the market to all goods and services produced in a country. This is the market for everything. And we refer to it in an abbreviated way as the goods market, but it includes services. So we need to be able to model the demand side of this aggregated market for all goods and services, as well as the supply side. The demand side we call aggregate demand. To understand aggregate demand, we're going to start with the components of an economy's GDP. And we take this from the national income identity. There are 4 components. First one is consumption. Consumption goods, food, transportation, entertainment, the goods and services that are intended to be sort of used up in the current period. There is the demand for investment goods, capital goods, buildings, equipment, and facilities, installations. As a separate category, since consumption and investment, those components refer to spending by private individuals and companies. As a third category, we have government spending on its programs and public sector salaries and the services it provides directly to its citizens. And the final component is the difference between exports and imports that we call net exports, or that you know otherwise as the trade balance. Let us investigate these four components to see if we can understand what are the factors that determine the levels of each of them, starting with consumption. The amount of consumption spending by private individuals and companies in an economy is going to be determined, unsurprisingly, by the level of income of the residents of that economy. As it is for an individual, the more income a person has, the more income of those in an economy, the greater is going to be the level of consumption spending. That much is straightforward. But the relationship between income and consumption is not a deterministic one, because other factors can come into play at various times. And one important other factor that comes into play is the level of wealth. That how much an individual is going to spend out of their current income is going to be influenced by the stock of wealth that that person has. Somebody who has no wealth, or perhaps somebody who has negative wealth, somebody who is in debt, is much more likely to spend a small portion of their income on consumption goods in an effort to save or to pay off their debt. Whereas a person who's already wealthy, has a large stock of assets, is more likely to be consuming more of their income, because the need, the compulsion to save, and the obligation to pay off debt is going to be less. So in the same way as the higher the level of income, the greater is going to be the level of consumption in an economy, then also the greater the stock of debt, the higher the level of consumption spending in an economy. So income and wealth are the primary determinants of the level of consumption spending. What determines the level of spending on capital goods? What determines the fixed capital formation, investment in an economy? Well, the one we're going to focus on, and again, there are many variables at play, but the one we're going to focus on is the rate of interest. And the rate of interest is determined in the market for investable funds, in the credit market. In the credit market, there is a supply of savings that comes from private domestic savings and from foreign savings that are made available to the domestic economy, not only by way of lending, but by way of imported goods that exceed the amount of exports, and so allow for domestic savings. And also government savings. If government taxes more than they are spending, if they are running a fiscal surplus, then that adds to the pool of savings in a credit market. So we have the available pool of savings for investment, and we have investment demand, and that determines the interest rate in the economy, and therefore, by way of the interest rate, the willingness of investors and the ability of investors to buy investment goods. The third component, government spending, is not so much, at least in the way we're going to treat it, determined by any other variable, as much as it's determined as a matter of policy. So the Minister of Finance is going to determine how much spending the government is willing to make over the course of the fiscal year and how it is going to be financed. So it's a decision. It's a decision on what is the balance of expenditure, taxation, and borrowing that government is willing to engage in. It's a policy decision. Net exports is determined primarily by the real exchange rate, because the real exchange rate determines how rewarding it is to export and how costly it is to buy imports. And the real exchange rate is determined in the foreign exchange market. And the flows in the foreign exchange market come from the capital account of the balance of payments, which is simply to say it comes from capital inflows and outflows, whether for direct investment or for portfolio investment. And flows also come from people's desire to trade. So all of the inflows and outflows of foreign exchange in the foreign exchange market determine the real exchange rate. And the real exchange rate determines how much people actually export and import. And the net of exports over imports represents the net demand for what is produced in the local economy. So what is produced in the local economy is demanded by consumers, it's demanded by investors, it's demanded by the government, and it's demanded by foreigners. And those are our four components of aggregate demand, and therefore the determinants you see are the ones that ultimately determine the aggregate demand for goods and services in an economy: income, wealth, interest rates, the government's fiscal policy, and the real exchange rate. We want to use this information to construct the demand curve for all goods and services, aggregate demand. In this aggregate market, in the goods market, the vertical axis shows not the price of any particular good or services, but the price level, the average price of all goods and services. Horizontal axis measures the real output of the economy, the volume of output, real GDP. So to derive the aggregate demand curve, we're going to start with an arbitrary price level, whatever price level obtains in the economy at the current time and the current level of output. Why do we need to derive the aggregate demand curve? Don't we sort of know that demand curves are downward sloping? Well, for one thing, the idea that the demand curve for milk or the demand curve for dresses and movie tickets is downward sloping is largely based on the ability of consumers to switch their consumption to other goods and services. If the price of one good or service goes up, then consumers switch to alternatives. What we are dealing with here is the market for all goods and services. So when all prices go up, what do people switch to? So the point is, we don't want to take for granted that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. We want to persuade ourselves that even though we are talking about all goods and services, that the demand curve is nevertheless downward sloping. So if we start with an arbitrary price level, whatever is the current price level and whatever is the current level of demand, aggregate demand for goods and services, what happens to that demand if prices were higher? If we just posit higher prices, how is it going to affect these components of aggregate demand? It's going to affect them actually through a number of channels. First, it's going to affect the level of wealth. wealth has two components. You have real assets like your house and your share of ownership in some business, and those are not necessarily affected by the economy just having a higher price level, because the real value of those assets remain the same. A house is a house, a business is a business. But the other part of wealth in the economy is wealth that is denominated in terms of money, like how much you have in your savings account. Whatever is denominated in terms of money is going to lose real value. It's going to lose purchasing power if prices are higher. So when we posit a higher price level, it diminishes the real value of nominally denominated wealth, of wealth that is denominated in terms of money. So therefore, a higher price level lowers total real wealth in an economy, and as we just discussed, if people feel they have less wealth, they're going to reduce their consumption. So we have one channel through which higher prices in an economy is going to result in a fall in aggregate demand, because it results in a fall in consumption spending. There's a second channel that works through the exchange rate, that other things remaining unchanged, a higher price level until the nominal exchange rate adjusts. A higher price level reduces the real exchange rate. And with a lower real exchange rate, that means that exports are going to be less and imports are going to be more. A lower real exchange rate makes it cheaper to buy imports. So consumers and businesses are going to switch their spending from domestically produced goods and services towards now relatively cheaper imports. We can put this in a simpler way. If local prices go up and the nominal exchange rate doesn't, then domestically produced goods become more expensive relative to foreign goods, and people switch their consumption to foreign goods. So therefore, imports are higher, net exports are low, and demand for local goods and services go down. So just from those two channels alone, we can persuade ourselves that a higher price level leads to less demand for domestically produced goods and services, and therefore an economy's aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. So we know what is going on along the aggregate demand curve. That higher price level or a lower price level causes demand for goods and services to fall or to rise. If any factor other than the overall price level is going to change, if wealth goes up for any reason other than a change in prices, if interest rates are higher, if the government changes its fiscal policy, or if the real exchange rate changes for some other reason, then to accommodate that, we shift the aggregate demand curve to the left or to the right, depending on whether these other changes is causing an increase or a decrease in aggregate demand. So a shift of the aggregate demand curve to the right would be because real wealth has gone up, or real interest rates have gone down, or the government pursues an expansionary fiscal policy where it increases its spending and doesn't increase taxation. a shift of the aggregate demand curve to the left would be caused by any of those factors, any of those variables going in the opposite direction. So a fall in real wealth, perhaps a stock market crash, or a reduction in real interest rates. So that's the aggregate demand curve, and that's how it behaves. The aggregate demand, that is the demand for all goods and services added together, is made up of consumption, investment, government procurement, and net exports.